Not every Viking subscribed to the live fast, die young ethos, but we do know that lifespans were generally shorter in the Viking Age. From the skeletons that we found from that period, we know that not many people lived more than 40 to 50 years, which isn't an unusual life expectancy for many in the medieval period. But if you did live past your 50th birthday, what was it like to be a geriatric Viking? Welcome to the Viking Vault. The archaeological record can give us a bit more insight into how Vikings lived, how long they lived, and even how their health was. But this is going to vary from country to country and throughout the centuries of the Viking Age, and even getting the scholars to agree on what would count as old for a Viking is difficult. From the skeletal remains of dead Vikings, we know that it was rare for anyone to live into their 60s, and there is evidence that their health would have been starting to fail even in their late 40s and 50s. That being said, it seems as though Viking Age women were more likely to survive into old age than men, as shown by the skeletal evidence from a cemetery in Orkney. There were 32 skeletons uncovered there, and 8 of these were buried there with traditional Viking Age grave goods. The average age of their death was in their 40s for both men and women, but 4 of the women had died aged between 50 and 70. And one woman was even older, between 60 and 80 when she died. It seems that if a woman could survive childbirth, then she was likely to live longer than a man. Most men died between ages 35 and 50, possibly because they were the ones who had to go out and fight. However, we can't make sweeping statements that this is true of all Viking settlements. 32 skeletons from Orkney doesn't reflect the full scope of the Viking Age. It looks like Vikings who lived longer would also have struggled with their health as they got older. In a cemetery in York, a mature Viking man was found to have survived a blade injury as it was well healed. His skeleton had degeneration in his spine and knees, as well as arthritis in a lot of his joints, which probably caused him pain and meant that he couldn't contribute as much to the household. This makes sense in the wider scope of the Viking world. It seems that arthritis was a common ailment, and many Viking skeletons have teeth that are missing or worn down. Although there aren't that many with cavities, as they rarely ate sugar. Senicide. Senicide, or the practice of killing your old people so you don't have to look after them in their old age, is not one that's closely associated with the Vikings. But it is possible that Vikings did engage in ritualized geriatric suicide, at least according to the legends. The term Artestupa is a Swedish word that means kin-clan precipice, and is used to describe a number of cliffs and other precipices throughout Sweden where old people would have thrown themselves to their deaths. The word itself doesn't really come into use until the 17th century, but does seem to date back to an Icelandic saga called Gotrek's Saga. This saga is partly set in Sweden and tells of a family that is so mean that they would rather die than be charitable towards others. In the story, the family take it in turn to jump from a tall cliff. Legend has it that the Ostupa could have happened during periods of hardship and famine, when elderly people who couldn't contribute any more to the household would take themselves to nearby cliffs and throw themselves off so that they wouldn't be a burden anymore. In reality, it's unlikely that suicide by cliff jumping ever really happened, and Gotrek's Saga was meant more as a morality tale to warn Vikings of the perils of being parsimonious. Being old in the sagas. Aging is a scary concept, and the idea of looking after your aging relatives is not one that many of us relish. Some cultures put high value on honouring your elders, whilst others don't have that tradition. But what did the Vikings think? For a society that seemed to place high importance on masculinity and physical capability, you might expect that the elderly and infirm would not be well looked after. These sagas also show negative attitudes towards the elderly, with the iconic portrayal of Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, anti-hero, and chieftain, showing the derision he faced for being old. Now blind and nearly deaf, Egil totters out of his cottage on shaky legs, and is met by laughter. None of his previous exploits matter in the face of his frailty. In most of the sagas that we have from medieval Iceland, old bodies are laughed at and considered weak. But how much of this is accurate? Sagas can't really be relied upon to give truthful representations of how people lived and how society functioned. Often these stories talk about the interesting stuff that happened. Boring people who lived unremarkable lives wouldn't make it into the sagas, and so boring old people are doubly damned. The sagas mostly recount tales of powerful heroes in Norse and Icelandic history, but there are some that are excellent sources of information about the elderly in the Viking Age. One such saga is the Bardamana saga, which is one of the sagas of the Icelanders and tells the story of Ofig, an old man, although not a rich one, who turns up to advise his estranged son in court. He's described as, quote, an elderly man in a black-sleeved cape. It was threadbare and had only one sleeve. Ophir is shown here to be poor and physically incapable. He leans on a stick for support, walking with a stoop. He's described as wearing his hood low, possibly to hide his infirmity. He's consistently called old and wise, indicating that although his age made him frail, he has gathered enough wisdom to make him a shrewd advisor in difficult situations. In Egil's saga, we also see another old man called Unadru, who ended up giving control of the farm to his son for housekeeping, as he was no longer able to do the work to keep the property up anymore. However, despite Egil and Unadru being considered too old to be useful or have any sort of control, neither of them are cast out. Unadru stays with his son and family, and Egil moves into his favourite daughter's house after his wife dies. Egil is clearly unhappy with the way he is treated as he ages. In his saga, he frequently complains about being shooed away from the fireplace, and mourns the powerful position he used to hold as a young man. Old in body, old in soul. Physical descriptions of age and infirmity in the saga often show a person's weakness. Their bodies become stiff and they move slowly, as well as needing more sleep and to be close to the fire. The elderly were also considered frail in spirit, as shown in Egil's saga, where Kveldulf is told about his son's death and takes to his bed from, quote, sorrow and age. This sort of weakness crops up again in Brynjar Njald's saga, where Njal is so devastated by the death of his foster son that he isn't able to talk about it without being visibly upset. This emotional response could be linked to what a Viking expected from his sons. Maybe the loss of an older son is devastating to an older father because he was relying on his son's support in his old age. Ulfric from Bandamana's saga is shrewd despite his age. He frequently uses other people's perceptions that he is old and stupid to his advantage, counting on the fact that they will underestimate his mental acuity to get the results he wants. This cautionary tale warns against judging someone based on their age, showing that just because someone is old in years doesn't mean that they've lost their marbles. Being intelligent and able to control the outcome of a situation is also considered a commendable attribute for a Viking. As shown when Ulfric is successful and starts to play an active role in events, he straightens up and regains a sparkle in his eye. Agency was important to Vikings, and the worst thing that could happen to a Viking was to stop being able to contribute or influence events. This is shown nowhere better than Brynjar Njald's saga. At the climax of the saga, Njald's house is about to be burned down by a man called Flosi. Flosi lets the women, children and servants escape from the house before setting it on fire, and even offers the same chance to Njal, who is now an old man. Njal refuses though, saying that he is an old man now and wouldn't be able to seek vengeance for his sons. He says that he couldn't live with the shame and that he would rather die with honor than live knowing that he was too old and therefore too weak to avenge his family. But what about Granny? So far, we've mostly talked about how getting older affected men. They're the ones with the most to lose and are more represented in the sagas. It seems that growing old meant losing status and power, relinquishing respect to the younger generation, and hoping to still be able to contribute in some way. Women are not often main characters in the sagas, even during their youth, and this doesn't change for old women either. Elderly women are often pushed to the sides and barely represented, except Una in the Laxdæla saga. Una lived a long life, amassing a great fortune that kept her well into her old age. She's described as thorny and replies angrily if anyone ever asks how she's doing, and hated being asked how old she was. Old men and marriage, a thorny subject at the best of times. The Icelandic Law Codex includes an interesting paragraph that states that a man who is over 80 years old isn't able to get married without having his children's approval. This is almost definitely linked to the inheritance. Grown children do not want to be sharing the family farm with another heir, but would have also been linked to the other factors around his age. It's speculated that there was a lack of eligible women in Iceland in the Viking Age, and an old man taking a young wife would be making it more difficult for other men to find suitable wives and have children. Dying well. Being old in the Viking Age was difficult. Losing other people's respect and your own dignity, as well as becoming physically frail, meant that many Vikings struggled with getting old. They relied on having strong children to support them as they aged, a difficult thing to do in a society where most people died before their 50th birthday. Dying with dignity was important, as we can see in Una's death in the Laxdæla saga. It's said that, quote, everyone was impressed at how well Una had kept her dignity to her dying day, as she was found sitting up and facing her death with honor. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you next week for another video. Have a great week. Cheers.